Divorce papers carry a distinct smell. Crisp, legal stock, fresh printer ink, and the sterile metallic scent of an ending. David kept them hidden in his leather briefcase pressed right against his Mont Blanc pen. He watched his wife Beatrice carefully scrape the last sticky remnants of store-brand strawberry jam from a glass jar. She wore a faded gray cardigan that looked like a thrift store reject. He sighed, adjusting his silk tie. Tonight he would finally cut the dead weight. Steam hissed aggressively from the dented metal spout of the kettle. Beatrice poured the boiling water over a paper filter filled with discount coffee grounds. The bitter, almost burnt aroma filled the cramped kitchen of their two-bedroom apartment, completely overpowering the subtle notes of bergamot and cedar in David's $50 cologne. David stood near the doorway watching her. He checked the gold face of his watch. 7:15. His stomach was a tight, acidic knot. Beatrice tapped the wooden spoon against the rim of her favorite ceramic mug, a chipped, ugly thing she'd bought at a garage sale 6 years ago. She was humming a tuneless little melody under her breath. Her hair, a pale, dusty blonde, was pulled back in a messy clip, a few stray strands falling across her neck. She looked ordinary, exhaustingly, painfully ordinary. "Do you want me to pack the leftover chicken for your lunch?" she asked, not turning around. Her voice was soft, carrying that perpetual, maddening gentleness that used to calm him but now only grated on his nerves like sandpaper. "No," David said sharply. He cleared his throat, trying to smooth out the edge in his tone. "I have a client lunch, the Langham." Beatrice paused, the wooden spoon hovering over the sink. "The Langham. That's expensive, David." "The firm is paying B. It's for the Miller account." He watched her shoulders drop a fraction of an inch before she resumed washing the spoon. That was her signature move, the microscopic deflation of a woman who viewed a $50 steak as a moral failing. David turned away, walking into the living room to grab his briefcase from the worn fabric sofa. His fingers brushed the cool, rigid leather of the handle. Inside, neatly tucked into a manila envelope, were 30 pages of legalese, designed to cleanly and surgically amputate Beatrice from his life. He hadn't always resented her. When they met in college, her frugality had felt romantic. They were broke students eating instant noodles on a mattress on the floor, mapping out their brilliant futures. But then David graduated. He fought tooth and nail to claw his way up the ladder of high-end wealth management. He learned to talk like the rich, dress like the rich, and drink scotch that burned his throat but signaled his arrival in their club. Beatrice just stayed. She got a quiet job cataloging historical texts at a dusty municipal library. She refused to buy designer labels, insisting that a $20 pair of jeans covered her legs just as well. When David got his first big bonus and suggested a vacation to St. Bart's, Beatrice had panicked at the price tag and begged to go camping in a state park instead. They went camping. It rained for 3 days. David spent the entire trip sitting in a damp nylon tent, furious realizing he had married an anchor. He wanted gallus penthouses and a partner who could charm a CEO over beluga caviar. She wanted clipping coupons and preserving vegetables in mason jars. "Tonight is the firm's charity dinner," David called out toward the kitchen, snapping the clasps of his briefcase shut. The metallic click sounded exceptionally loud in the quiet apartment. "You haven't forgotten." Beatrice appeared in the doorway, wiping her wet hands on a faded dish towel. "I haven't forgotten. 7 o'clock at the Pierre Hotel." I laid my dress out on the bed. David grimaced internally. He knew exactly which dress it was, a shapeless navy blue crepe thing she'd owned for half a decade. It was practically a uniform of mediocrity. "Right," David muttered. "Please just try to mingle tonight, B. Arthur Sterling is going to be there. If I can get 5 minutes of FaceTime with him, it could guarantee my promotion to senior partner. I need everything to look perfect." He needed her to look perfect. Or failing that, he needed her to just stand quietly in a corner and not mention that she bought her shoes on clearance. Beatrice looked at him. Her eyes were a strange, pale gray, often unreadable. For a brief second, David thought he saw a flicker of something sharp behind her gaze, a flash of deep, ancient exhaustion. But then she blinked, and it was gone, replaced by her usual placid expression. "I'll be fine, David. Have a good day." She turned back to her cheap coffee. David grabbed his coat and walked out the door, the heavy oak slamming shut behind him. The hallway smelled like floor wax and old dust. He gripped his briefcase tightly, the leather handle digging into his palm. It was the right decision. He repeated the mantra in his head as he waited for the elevator. It's the right decision. He was drowning in this marriage. He was 32 years old, standing on the precipice of real life-altering wealth, and he couldn't afford to be dragged back down to the bargain bin. Tonight, after the gala, they would come home. He would sit her down on the cheap sofa she refused to replace. He would hand her the envelope. He would offer her a generous but final settlement. The elevator arrived with a cheerful ding. David stepped inside, catching his reflection in the mirrored doors. His suit was tailored perfectly, the wool catching the harsh, fluorescent light. He looked like a man who belonged in a penthouse. He breathed in his own expensive cologne, letting the scent wash away the lingering ghost of Beatrice's burnt coffee. Tonight he would finally be free. The ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a sensory assault. 1,000 crystal prisms dangling from 3 massive chandeliers fractured the warm, golden light across the ceiling. The air was thick and heavy, saturated with the suffocating blend of a dozen different bespoke perfumes, roasting filet mignon, and the sharp, yeast-heavy scent of Dom Perignon. David stood near the edge of the dance floor, his fingers gripped tightly around the stem of a crystal flute. His tuxedo jacket felt restrictive across his shoulders, but he kept his posture rigidly straight. This was his arena. He was currently tracking Arthur Sterling, the gray-haired titan of the firm who was holding court near the Raw Bar. Excellent year for the firm, wouldn't you say, David? David swallowed a groan and turned to his right. Richard. The man was a walking trust fund, a junior partner who had secured his position entirely through a lineage of wealthy uncles. Richard's smile was slick, his teeth almost aggressively white. "It's been profitable, yes," David replied smoothly, adopting the neutral, low-baritone cadence he used exclusively for networking. Richard took a sip of his bourbon, his eyes scanning the crowd, before landing on a spot near the ice sculpture. "Why, I see Beatrice made it out of the library tonight." David stiffened. He followed Richard's gaze. Beatrice was standing alone near a towering display of white orchids. She was wearing the navy blue crepe dress. Under the unforgiving brilliance of the chandeliers, the fabric looked deeply tired. She wasn't wearing any jewelry, save for her plain gold wedding band. While the women around her glittered with diamonds and dripped in silk, Beatrice looked like a pigeon who had accidentally wandered into a flock of peacocks. She was holding a glass of sparkling water, quietly observing the room with that unsettling, calm gaze. She prefers to keep a low profile. David lied, his jaw clenching so hard his back teeth ached. He hated her in that moment. He hated that she didn't care. He hated that her refusal to play the game reflected poorly on him. Very grounded of her. Richard murmured, the condescension dripping from the word like honey. He clapped David lightly on the shoulder. "Excuse me, I need to go kiss the ring. Arthur is looking restless." Richard sauntered away. David drained the rest of his champagne, the bubbles burning the back of his throat. That was it. The final nail in the coffin. He couldn't do this for the rest of his career. He couldn't spend the next 20 years apologizing for his wife's profound lack of ambition and style. The papers in his briefcase back home felt heavier, a phantom weight pressing against his mind. He set his empty glass on a passing waiter's tray and began to navigate the crowd, aiming to intercept Arthur Sterling before Richard completely monopolized him. Suddenly, a subtle shift rippled through the ballroom. It wasn't a sound, but rather an abrupt drop in the ambient noise. The dull roar of 300 conversations simultaneously dialed back. David stopped near a table of hors d'oeuvres, frowning. He looked toward the grand double doors at the entrance. A small entourage had entered. At the center was an older man. He moved with a glacial, terrifying grace. He wasn't wearing a standard tuxedo. He wore a midnight blue evening coat with a faint, iridescent sheen, adorned with a subtle, dark silk rosette on the left lapel. Two men in sharp black suits flanked him, scanning the room with the predatory stillness of high-level security. David recognized him instantly, and his heart gave a violent, painful thump against his ribs. It was Henrik von Kassel. He was one of the most elusive and powerful men in Europe, a shadow broker whose family wealth dwarfed the GDP of several small nations. He owned banks, shipping lines, and massive swathes of real estate across 2 continents. Having von Kassel at this gala wasn't just a coup, it was an anomaly. The man rarely made public appearances, let alone at a mid-tier Manhattan charity dinner. Even Arthur Sterling had paused mid-sentence, looking suddenly nervous, hastily straightening his tie as he prepared to grovel. Von Kassel ignored the firm's senior partners. He ignored the mayor. He ignored the billionaires, practically vibrating with desperation to catch his eye. He bypassed the center of the room entirely, his polished shoes silent against the thick carpet. He was walking toward the ice sculpture. David froze. He watched, unable to process the geometry of the situation. Von Kassel was heading straight for the corner where Beatrice was standing. "Get out of the way," David thought frantically, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Don't embarrass me. Move." But Beatrice didn't move. She set her glass of sparkling water down on a cocktail table. She turned to face the advancing billionaire. Von Kassel stopped 2 feet away from her. The 2 security men stepped back, forming a discreet, impenetrable wall around them. The entire ballroom was now completely silent, the soft jazz playing from the bandstand, sounding painfully loud in the vacuum. David took a hesitant step forward, his mind scrambling for a way to intervene, to apologize for his wife, blocking the path of a European titan. But before David could open his mouth, Henrik von Kassel did something that shattered David's reality into 1,000 jagged pieces. The older man lowered his chin, folded his right arm across his chest, and bowed deeply from the waist. It wasn't a polite nod. It was an act of total, unadulterated deference. "Your Grace," von Kassel said. His voice was gravelly, carrying a thick, aristocratic German accent that carried perfectly in the quiet room. "The estate sends its apologies for the intrusion, but your grandfather's condition has worsened. We require your signature to release the sovereign funds." David's lungs stopped working. The ambient heat of the ballroom vanished, replaced by a freezing, suffocating numbness. Beatrice looked down at the bowing billionaire. She didn't look flustered. She didn't look confused. She sighed a slow, heavy exhalation that sounded identical to the sigh she made when scraping the last of the jam from the jar. She reached up and pulled the messy clip from her hair, letting the pale blonde strands fall loose around her shoulders. "I told the council I wanted another year, Henrik," Beatrice said softly. Her voice was the same, but the tone had shifted. The gentle, deferential meekness was gone. In its place was a ringing, unquestionable authority. "Time is a luxury the throne no longer possesses, Lady Beatrice," von Kassel murmured finally, rising from his bow. "We must return tonight." David stood 5 feet away, anchored to the carpet, a single, terrifying thought echoing in his hollowed-out skull. What the hell is going on? Gravity felt fundamentally altered. David's Oxford seemed welded to the thick, patterned carpet of the Pierre Hotel ballroom. The ambient temperature, previously stifling from the press of 300 warm bodies, plummeted into a freezing, clinical chill. He stared at Beatrice's back. The cheap, navy blue crepe of her dress, a garment he had despised for years, suddenly looked like a deliberate disguise, a piece of tactical camouflage shed in plain sight. The word clawed its way out of his throat, barely a rasp. It sounded horribly loud in the dead silence of the room. It sounded pathetic. Beatrice didn't flinch. She turned slowly, the movement lacking her usual, hesitant, apologetic shuffle. Her pale gray eyes met his. For 6 years, David had read those eyes as meek, passive, and maddeningly simple. Now he saw the terrifying depth behind them. It wasn't simplicity. It was a profound, exhaustion-fueled restraint. She was looking at him not as a wife caught in a lie, but as an adult watching a toddler throw a tantrum over a broken toy. "David," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It held the flat, resonant pitch of someone entirely accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He took a jerky, uncoordinated step forward, the instinct to grab her arm to physically pull her back into the reality he understood overrode his frozen shock. He didn't make it 2 feet. One of Henrik von Kassel's security men, a broad-shouldered wall of black wool and silent menace, shifted a mere half-step to the left. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't speak, but his presence was a physical barricade carrying the implied violence of a loaded gun. David stopped, his heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. Sweat prickled at his hairline, dampening the starched collar of his tailored shirt. "B, what is this? Who are these people?" he demanded, his voice cracking on the last syllable. He sounded like a panicked child. Henrik von Kassel turned his head slightly, regarding David with the same detached interest one might give a smudge on a clean window. The billionaire didn't ask who David was. He didn't care. To a man who moved global markets before breakfast, a mid-tier wealth manager was less than a rounding error. "We have a private jet waiting at Teterboro." "On your grace," Henrik murmured to Beatrice, his thick German accent rolling over the syllables. "The medical team is keeping him stabilized, but the royal physician assures me it is a matter of hours. The succession protocols must be initiated before morning. Your grace, royal physician. Succession protocols." The words hit David like physical blows to the sternum. He tasted copper in the back of his mouth. He looked around the room, desperate for a tether. The senior partners of his firm, men he had spent years trying to impress, were standing frozen with their mouths slightly open. Richard, the arrogant trust fund junior, looked physically ill, his manicured hands gripping his bourbon glass so tightly his knuckles were bone white. They were all staring at Beatrice. "I know Henrik," Beatrice replied softly, rubbing 2 fingers against her temple. It was a gesture of immense, ancient fatigue. "I just needed more time." "You had 6 years, Beatrice," Henrik said, his tone softening a fraction, losing the formal deference for a brief moment of familiarity. "It is over. You cannot hide in this life anymore." He gestured vaguely to the ballroom, dismissing the billionaires, the mayors, and the silk-clad elite as nothing more than a child's sandbox. He dismissed David. Beatrice finally looked at her husband again. The anger David expected to feel, the righteous fury of being deceived, was nowhere to be found. It was drowned out by a terrifying, suffocating inadequacy. "I'm sorry, David," she said. Her words were perfectly measured, devoid of the emotional, messy begging he would have expected. "I really did try to make this work. I wanted to be ordinary. I wanted a life where the biggest crisis was a burnt roast or a late mortgage payment. You," David choked on the air, his chest heaving. "You lied. Everything. The budget, the coupons, the library." "The library was quiet," she interrupted gently but firmly. "And the budget was necessary. If I used my own accounts, they would have found me on day 1. I had to live exactly as you did." She stepped away from the cocktail table, moving past the imposing wall of the security guard. She didn't reach out to touch him. The invisible chasm between them had suddenly ripped open into a bottomless canyon. "I'll have my people contact your lawyers by the end of the week to handle the dissolution," Beatrice stated, adjusting the strap of her cheap faux leather handbag. "You can keep the apartment and the accounts. Consider it compensation for the inconvenience." Compensation for the inconvenience. She was talking about their marriage like it was a canceled lease agreement. She was talking exactly the way David had planned to talk to her tonight. Armed with the divorce papers, currently sitting in his briefcase. The brutal irony of it twisted in his gut like a rusted knife. He was going to offer her a generous settlement to disappear. She was tossing him the scraps of his own life like spare change. "Let's go, Henrik," Beatrice said, turning her back on him. The security men fell into a perfect synchronized formation around her. Henrik von Kassel offered a curt, formal nod to the room at large, and the entourage began to move toward the grand double doors. The crowd parted violently. Billionaires and power brokers shoved each other out of the way, desperate to clear a path for the woman in the faded navy dress. David stood completely alone on the edge of the dance floor, the frantic jazz music from the bandstand still playing a jarring, mocking soundtrack to the utter collapse of his existence. He watched the heavy wooden doors close behind her, swallowing his wife and taking his entire reality with her. Cold wind whipped off the Hudson River, biting through the thin wool of David's tuxedo jacket as he stood on the pavement outside the Pierre. He didn't remember walking out of the ballroom. He didn't remember retrieving his coat from the cloakroom. His body was operating on a numb, mechanical autopilot, dragging him away from the whispers and the staring eyes of his colleagues. He hailed a yellow cab sliding into the cracked vinyl back seat. The car smelled overwhelmingly of stale pine air freshener and old cigarette smoke. It was a perfectly ordinary, gritty New York smell, and it made him want to vomit. "Upper West Side," David muttered, giving the driver his address. He stared out the smudged window at the blur of city lights, his mind trapped in a terrifying, recursive loop. "Your Grace, sovereign funds, a private jet at Teterboro." He tried to overlay those massive, impossible concepts onto the woman who spent Sundays meticulously darning the holes in his socks to save money. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful, a splitting headache blooming directly behind his eyes. 30 minutes later, David shoved his key into the deadbolt of their apartment door. The lock stuck just like it always did, requiring a hard, upward jiggle. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the cramped hallway. The apartment was pitch black, utterly silent, and suffocatingly familiar. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. He walked into the kitchen, the glow from the street lamps outside, casting long, distorted shadows across the linoleum floor. The smell hit him instantly. The sharp, bitter tang of the discount coffee she drank mingled with the faint, sugary scent of the store-brand strawberry jam. David dropped his keys on the counter. The metallic clatter was deafening. He looked at the sink. The cheap, chipped ceramic mug she had bought at a garage sale for 50 cents was sitting exactly where she had left it. The wooden spoon was resting neatly on a folded paper towel. "I wanted to be ordinary." Her words echoed in the dark kitchen. She had been playing house for 6 years while David had ground himself into dust, trying to climb a ladder to reach the upper echelons of society. Beatrice had been deliberately slumming it. She hadn't been an anchor dragging him down. She had been a god walking among mortals, desperately pretending she didn't know how to fly. He walked into the living room and sank onto the worn, scratchy fabric of the sofa. It groaned under his weight. He reached out and dragged his leather briefcase onto his lap. The smooth, rigid texture of the Italian leather felt alien against his shaking hands. He unclasped it. He reached inside and pulled out the thick manila envelope. David opened the flap and slid the divorce papers out. The bright white legal stock practically glowed in the dim light. He stared at the meticulously drafted clauses, the careful division of their meager assets, the small, condescending alimony payment he had generously negotiated with his lawyer to ensure she wouldn't starve. He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. It scraped painfully against his throat. He had been so arrogant. He had stood in this exact room 12 hours ago, adjusting his silk tie, feeling profound pity for his pathetic, unambitious wife. He had been ready to throw her away because she didn't fit into the glossy, wealthy future he was trying to build. And all along she possessed a level of power and wealth that made his firm's senior partners look like panhandlers. A sharp, authoritative knock at the apartment door made him jump. David dropped the divorce papers on the sofa. He walked slowly back out to the hallway, his muscles tight, half expecting Beatrice to be standing there, claiming this was some elaborate, cruel prank. He opened the door. Two men stood in the hallway. They weren't the security guards from the gala. They were dressed in impeccable, understated gray suits, holding nothing but a slim leather folio. They looked like high-end fixers. Men who scrubbed crime scenes or dissolved corporations before breakfast. "Mr. Miller," the taller one asked. His voice was polite, flat, and entirely empty. "Yes," David breathed. "We are here on behalf of the von Kassel estate. We have been instructed to retrieve Her Grace's personal effects." The man didn't wait for permission. He stepped past David, moving into the apartment with smooth, practiced efficiency. The second man followed, opening the folio. "What are you taking?" David asked, his voice shaking. He followed them into the bedroom. The men completely ignored the closet full of faded cardigans and clearance rack jeans. They ignored the cheap costume jewelry on the dresser. Instead, the taller man walked directly to the nightstand. He pulled open the bottom drawer, feeling along the underside of the wood until there was a soft click. A false bottom popped loose. David stared. He had slept next to that nightstand for 4 years. The man reached inside and extracted a small, heavy-looking steel lockbox. He placed it inside a dark canvas bag he slung over his shoulder. Next, he moved to a loose floorboard under the radiator, extracting a bundle of passports and a secure, encrypted hard drive. They weren't packing her clothes. They were extracting a deep-cover operative. "Is that it?" David whispered, watching them systematically erase the hidden infrastructure of her real life. "Are you taking the clothes?" The second man paused, glancing at the closet with a look of mild distaste. "We were instructed to leave the disguise, Mr. Miller. She has no use for these items in Vienna." The disguise. The men walked out, leaving the front door open behind them. They didn't say goodbye. David stood alone in the center of the bedroom, surrounded by the discarded, worthless husks of the woman he thought he knew. He looked down at the floor, catching the scent of the cheap lavender bleach she used to mop the hardwoods. The smell of his own arrogance. He was utterly, completely ruined, and he hadn't even lost a dime. The alarm clock shrieked at exactly 6:30. It was a harsh, synthetic blare that David usually slapped off before the second pulse. Today, he just lay there. He stared at the ceiling, watching the morning light crawl across the popcorn texture, counting the tiny, jagged shadows. The left side of the mattress was perfectly made cold and flat. It still smelled like the discount lavender detergent Beatrice insisted on buying in bulk. He finally dragged himself out of bed. The floorboards creaked under his bare feet, a sound he had complained about for years. Now, in the cavernous silence of the apartment, the noise felt like an intrusion. He moved through his morning routine with a numb, mechanical precision. He stood under the shower until the water turned tepid, the spray beating against his shoulders. He shaved, nicking his jawline because his hand wouldn't stop its subtle, irritating tremor. When he opened his closet to get dressed, his hand hovered over his collection of tailored suits. The Italian wool, the silk linings, the bespoke tailoring, they were supposed to be his armor. Today, they just felt like a costume he had stolen from a better actor. He chose a dark charcoal two-piece. He tied a Windsor knot. He grabbed his briefcase, avoiding looking at the divorce papers still sitting on the living room sofa, and walked out the door. The subway ride was a blur of screeching metal, flickering fluorescent lights, and the overwhelming scent of damp wool and stale coffee. David usually took a private town car to the office, a perk he expensed to the firm. Today he couldn't stomach the idea of sitting in the quiet luxury of a leather back seat. He needed the abrasive, crushing reality of the morning commute to prove he was still tethered to the ground. When he stepped off the elevator on the 40th floor of his firm's Madison Avenue headquarters, the atmosphere was wrong. Usually the reception area buzzed with the aggressive energy of junior analysts, ringing phones, and the sharp clack of leather heels on marble floors. Today, a heavy, suffocating quiet hung in the air. As David walked past the glass-walled conference rooms, the low hum of conversation abruptly died. Eyes darted toward him, then quickly looked away. He saw Richard near the water cooler, the junior partner who just last night had mocked Beatrice's cheap dress was pale. His arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by a tight, nervous grimace. Richard didn't make eye contact. He turned his back and practically jogged down the hall. David's stomach tightened into a cold, hard knot. He kept his chin up, walking to his corner office, dropping his briefcase heavily onto his mahogany desk. The phone immediately rang. "Mr. Miller." His assistant's voice crackled through the speaker. She sounded terrified. "Arthur wants to see you, now." David didn't take off his coat. He walked the 60 feet to the senior partner's corner suite, his leather Oxfords perfectly silent on the thick carpet. The door was open. Arthur Hayes, the man whose ring David had been trying to kiss for 3 years, was standing behind his desk staring out at the Manhattan skyline. His shoulders were rigid. "Close the door, David," Arthur commanded without turning around. David closed it. The heavy oak clicked shut, sealing out the ambient noise of the floor. "Arthur, about last night." "Shut up," Arthur snapped, finally turning. The older man looked like he had aged a decade overnight. The bags under his eyes were bruised and heavy. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this firm?" David swallowed hard, the brass taste of adrenaline flooding his mouth. "I didn't know. I swear to you, Arthur. I thought she was just a librarian." Arthur let out a harsh, barking laugh that held absolutely zero humor. "A librarian. You married the sole heir to the Von Cassel industrial empire, a family that controls shipping lanes, European telecom, and private equity funds larger than the GDP of a developing nation. And you spent the last 6 years treating her like a tax write-off." "That's my personal life," David argued, a flare of defensive anger piercing his shock. "It has nothing to do with my performance here." "It has everything to do with us," Arthur hissed, stepping toward the desk, leaning his weight on his knuckles. At 4:30 this morning, Henrik von Cassel's holding company initiated a hard withdrawal of all their assets, managed by our partner banks. $3 billion, David, gone before breakfast. They didn't leave a note. They didn't call. They simply severed the artery and let us bleed. David felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. He gripped the back of a leather guest chair to steady himself. $3 billion. And that's just the start. Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a vicious, quiet register. "My phone has been ringing off the hook since 5. Clients who run in those European circles are panicking. They think we're compromised. They think we're incompetent. You are radioactive, David. Just standing in the same room as you right now is costing me money." David stared at the older man, the reality of the situation crashing over him like a concrete wall. He wasn't just losing his wife. He was losing his identity. "Arthur, I can fix this. I can talk to her." "You will not go anywhere near her," Arthur ordered, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You are going to walk back to your desk. You are going to pack a box. You are officially on an indefinite administrative sabbatical. Your access cards will be deactivated at noon." "You're firing me." "I am quarantining you," Arthur corrected coldly. "Get out of my office, David." David didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. He turned and walked out, his expensive suit suddenly feeling exactly like what it was, a thin layer of wool over a hollow, ruined man. 4 weeks passed. The apartment smelled like dust, stale takeout, and despair. David hadn't shaved in 10 days. He wore a pair of gray sweatpants that had once belonged to Beatrice, the fabric stretched and ruined by his larger frame. He sat on the worn fabric sofa, staring blindly at the muted television screen, a half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon resting on the coffee table beside his useless, expensive briefcase. He hadn't left the apartment in a week. There was no point. His phone never rang. His emails went unanswered. His administrative sabbatical was a permanent exile. The industry had blacklisted him with silent, brutal efficiency. Nobody wanted to hire the man who had inadvertently insulted a European sovereign family. A sharp, authoritative knock at the door broke the heavy silence. David didn't move. He took a sip of the bourbon, letting the cheap alcohol burn its way down his throat. The knock sounded again louder this time, accompanied by a muffled voice. "Courier. Certified delivery for David Miller." He dragged himself up his joints, popping and shuffled to the door. He undid the deadbolt and pulled it open. A young man in a crisp uniform stood in the hallway holding a thick, dark leather folio. He didn't ask for a signature. He simply handed the heavy package to David, turned on his heel, and walked toward the elevator. David carried the folio to the kitchen island. He flipped on the overhead fluorescent light, wincing as the harsh glare stung his bloodshot eyes. He unzipped the leather case. Inside was a thick stack of documents. They weren't printed on standard white copy paper. They were heavy cream-colored cotton blend sheets, watermarked with a complex, archaic crest. The scent of the paper was distinct, dry, ancient, smelling faintly of wax and old archives. It was a sensory insult compared to, the cheap, staple-bound divorce papers he had drafted a month ago. He flipped to the first page. It was a dissolution of marriage drafted in both formal German and flawless English. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an edict. There was no mention of alimony. There was no division of their mismatched plates or the dented kettle. Instead, there was a non-disclosure agreement, so absolute, so suffocating in its scope, that it effectively erased his right to speak about the last 6 years of his life. He could not mention her name. He could not write a book. He could not speak to the press. If a journalist even asked him a question about her, he was legally obligated to report the interaction to a Geneva-based law firm within 24 hours. And then he reached the final page. The settlement. David stared at the number printed in bold black ink. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, assuming the bourbon was blurring his vision. He looked again. 15 million euros. It was an insulting, staggering amount of money. It was more money than David would have made in 20 years as a senior partner. It was wired into a secure offshore account, fully tax-exempt, available the moment his signature hit the bottom line. It wasn't a gift. It was a payoff. It was the exact numerical value the von Kassel estate placed on his silence and his complete disappearance from their reality. A wave of nausea washed over him, hot and metallic. He gripped the edge of the granite countertop, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to tear the heavy paper into shreds. He wanted to burn it in the sink. He wanted to march down to the consulate and throw the money back in her face. But he didn't. He picked up a cheap plastic pen lying on the counter, one Beatrice had stolen from the bank, and signed his name on the dotted line. He did it because he was broken. He did it because Arthur was right. He was radioactive, and this money was the only thing keeping him from ending up on the street. He signed away his pride, his marriage, and his history, his signature a shaky, pathetic scrawl. He left the documents on the counter and walked into the living room. He opened his laptop, the screen illuminating his pale, unshaven face. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. For 4 weeks, he had forbidden himself from doing this, but the signature had broken his final layer of restraint. He typed Beatrice von Kassel into the search engine. The internet exploded with her. There were thousands of articles, European tabloids, and financial columns. The Lost Duchess returns to the fold. Von Kassel Harris assumes control of sovereign funds. A quiet succession in Vienna. Woody. He clicked on the top news image. It was a high-resolution photograph taken outside a massive Baroque palace in Austria. Standing on the stone steps, surrounded by dignitaries and security, was his wife. She wasn't wearing a faded, navy blue crepe dress. She wore a tailored slate gray coat that looked sharper than a scalpel. Her pale blonde hair, usually held back by a cheap plastic clip, was perfectly styled, catching the European sun. but it was her face that destroyed him. The gentle, exhausted meekness that he had exploited for years was entirely gone. Her jaw was set. Her pale gray eyes were fixed on the camera lens, projecting an aura of cold, untouchable power. She looked like a predator who had finally stopped pretending to be prey. David stared at the screen until his eyes watered. He reached out his fingertips, brushing the cold glass of the monitor, tracing the outline of her face. He realized the most brutal truth of all. She hadn't stayed with him because she was an anchor too scared to climb. She stayed with him because his pathetic, frantic desperation for wealth was a perfect noisy cover for a woman hiding from an empire. He wasn't her husband. He had never been her husband. He was just her disguise. 15 million euros buys a suffocating amount of quiet. David relocated to a sprawling penthouse on Central Park West. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the city he had once desperately tried to conquer. The floors were radiant-heated Brazilian walnut. The kitchen appliances were matte black, German engineering, silent and cold. The air conditioning hummed at a frequency so low it felt like a pressure in his inner ear rather than a sound. He had everything he had ever wanted, and it was entirely violently empty. He spent the first month buying the armor he thought he deserved. He purchased 3 bespoke suits from Savile Row, the heavy worsted wool rough against his fingertips. He bought a Patek Philippe watch with a blue enamel dial, the alligator strap stiff against his wrist. He bought a sleek charcoal gray Aston Martin that he parked in a subterranean garage, the leather interior smelling sharply of ozone and new money. But there was nowhere to wear the suits. There was no one to check the watch for. His phone remained a useless black brick on his marble kitchen island. The wealth management industry operated on rumors, and the rumor surrounding David Miller was that he was an absolute liability. He hadn't just lost a client, he had personally offended a European dynasty. In the incestuous, paranoid circles of Manhattan finance, associating with David meant risking the wrath of the Von Cassel holding companies. He was a billionaire's ex-husband, a walking embargo. On a rainy Tuesday evening, the silence in the penthouse became physically unbearable. The soft patter of rain against the reinforced glass sounded like a ticking clock. David threw on a cashmere overcoat so soft it felt like spun water and took the private elevator down to the lobby. He walked 6 blocks to a high-end, dimly lit steakhouse he used to frequent with Arthur and the senior partners. The air inside was thick with the scent of roasted garlic, dry-aged beef, and expensive cigar smoke from the patio. It was the smell of power. It used to make his blood hum with ambition. Now it just made him nauseous. He sat at the mahogany bar, running his thumb over the condensation on a heavy crystal glass of single malt scotch. Down the bar near the brass espresso machine sat Richard. The junior partner was wearing a sharp navy suit, laughing loudly with a man David recognized as a managing director from a rival firm. David hesitated, his grip tightening on his glass. He hadn't spoken to anyone from his old life in 3 months. The urge for human connection, for a simple mocking conversation, suddenly overwhelmed his pride. David picked up his drink and closed the distance, sliding into the empty leather bar stool next to Richard. "Richard," David said, keeping his voice level. Richard stopped laughing. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, panicked revulsion. He didn't look David in the eye. He looked at David's collar, then darted his gaze around the dimly lit room to see who was watching them. "David," Richard muttered, his voice dropping to an anxious whisper. He pulled his drink closer to his chest, leaning away as if David had an infectious disease. "How are things at the firm?" David asked, ignoring the blatant rejection. He just wanted a crumb of normalcy. "Did Arthur manage to stabilize the European accounts?" Richard's jaw clenched. "You shouldn't be talking to me. You shouldn't even be in here." "I'm just having a drink, Rich." "Don't call me that." Richard snapped, his knuckles white around his glass. He finally met David's eyes, and the sheer hostility there made David physically flinch. "You cost my uncle $3 million in quarterly bonuses when Von Castle pulled their funds. Arthur had to fire 6 junior analysts just to balance the books. You don't exist to us anymore, David. Enjoy your blood money, but stay the hell away from my table." Richard threw a $50 bill onto the bar, grabbed his coat, and walked out without waiting for his change. His companion followed closely behind, casting a wary glance over his shoulder. David sat alone in the manufactured warmth of the steakhouse. The scotch burned the back of his throat, tasting like iodine and ash. He realized then that the $15 million wasn't a settlement. It was a severance package from society. Beatrice hadn't given him the money so he could live his dream. She gave it to him so he could build his own mausoleum. She knew exactly what would happen. She knew his firm would excommunicate him. She knew the money would buy him things, but strip him of his purpose. He walked back to the penthouse in the rain. He didn't use an umbrella, his cashmere coat soaked through heavy and smelling of wet sheep. When he entered the sterile, perfect apartment, he walked straight to the kitchen. He opened the massive stainless steel refrigerator. It was stocked with sparkling water, imported cheeses, and Wagyu beef. He stared at it all, his chest heaving. He didn't want the Wagyu. He wanted the bitter, burnt taste of cheap coffee. He wanted the sound of the dented kettle hissing on the stove. He wanted the friction of arguing over a $50 dinner. He missed the agonizing, grinding struggle of his old life, because at least in that life, he was moving forward. Now he was just a ghost haunting a glass box in the sky, completely erased by a woman who used to darn his socks. 6 months of isolation eroded David's sanity down to a dull, obsessive nub. He stopped tracking the stock market. He stopped reading the Wall Street Journal. Instead, his browser history was a singular, pathetic shrine to European financial news. He tracked the movements of the Von Castle estate with the manic dedication of a stalker. He learned the intricate hierarchy of the holding companies. He watched grainy press conference feeds in German, a language he didn't speak, just to watch Beatrice stand behind podiums surrounded by ministers of finance. She never smiled in the photos. She wore severe monochromatic business wear that cost more than his old apartment. She was a titan moving billions of euros, with a signature entirely devoid of the gentle, exhausted woman who used to clip grocery coupons on their cheap sofa. In November, a brief article in Le Temps mentioned that Her Grace the Duchess of Kassel would be delivering a keynote address at a closed-door economic summit in Geneva. David didn't think about the consequences. He didn't think about the ironclad, non-disclosure agreement locked in his safe. He just booked a first-class ticket on Swissair. The flight was a blur of complimentary champagne that tasted metallic and hot towels that smelled faintly of industrial lemon. He checked into the Four Seasons Hotel de Bergue, his suite overlooking the steel-gray expanse of Lake Geneva. The air in Switzerland was crisp, smelling of cold water and old stone. It felt clean. It felt like a place where things ended. The summit was held at a massive, heavily guarded convention center near the United Nations headquarters. David couldn't get inside the main hall. His wealth meant nothing against diplomatic credentials, but he bribed a concierge 5,000 francs to secure a ticket to the peripheral charity gala held in the atrium that evening. He arrived at 8 o'clock wearing his Savile Row tuxedo. The room was a sea of black ties, diamond necklaces, and muted multilingual conversations. It was the Pierre Hotel all over again, but magnified by 1,000. Here, the wealth wasn't just corporate, it was historical. It was bloodline wealth. He stood near a towering pillar of white marble, a glass of mineral water warming in his hand. He scanned the room, his pulse hammering a frantic, sickening rhythm against his collar, and then he saw her. She was standing on a raised VIP tier, separated from the main floor by a velvet rope, and 4 massive men with earpieces. She wore an emerald green silk gown that cascaded to the floor, her pale blonde hair pinned up in a complex, flawless twist. A subtle, terrifyingly expensive diamond necklace rested against her collarbone. She was speaking to a man David recognized as the French minister of finance. David's breath caught in his throat. The sheer gravitational pull of her presence across the room was undeniable. She looked utterly relaxed, commanding the space without raising her voice, a predator completely at ease in her apex environment. He took a step forward, his hand twitching at his side. He didn't know what he wanted to say. He just wanted her to look at him. He wanted to prove to his fractured mind that the last 6 years hadn't been a hallucination. "I would highly advise against taking another step, Mr. Miller." The voice was gravelly polite and coded in a thick German accent. It came from directly behind his left shoulder. David froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He turned slowly. Henrik von Kassel stood there holding a glass of dark red wine. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, his gray hair swept back. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly, exhaustingly bored. "Henrik," David breathed, his throat suddenly completely dry. "It is a violation of your agreement to be in this city while Her Grace is in residence," Henrik murmured, taking a slow sip of his wine. He didn't look at David. He kept his eyes fixed on the VIP tier. "The legal team in Zurich was notified the moment your passport was scanned at Cointrin Airport. They have already drafted the asset freeze injunctions." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded David's chest. "I didn't come to cause trouble. I needed to see her." "Why?" Henrik asked softly, finally turning his head. The older man's eyes were like chips of glacial ice. "To apologize, to beg, or simply to validate your own bruised ego." "She was my wife," David whispered, the words sounding pathetic and hollow even to his own ears. "She was an operative surviving behind enemy lines." Henrik corrected, his tone flat and brutal. "You were cover. You were a remarkably ordinary, predictably selfish man who provided the perfect camouflage for a woman hiding from her responsibilities. Do not confuse utility with affection, Mr. Miller." The words hit David like physical blows. He gripped his glass of water so tightly he thought the crystal might shatter. "She loved me," David argued, a desperate, childish plea. "In the beginning, she had to." Henrik sighed, a soft, patronizing sound. "Perhaps she enjoyed the novelty of a man who valued a $50 steak over a legacy. But the novelty wore off. You became a chore, David, a loud, demanding, terribly insecure chore. And when her grandfather died, the chore was no longer necessary." Henrik reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a heavy cream-colored envelope. He pressed it flat against David's chest. "Your return flight to New York departs at 6 a.m., Henrik stated quietly. "A car is waiting outside to take you to your hotel to pack. If you are not on that plane, the 15 million euros will be legally clawed back by noon tomorrow. You will be penniless, blacklisted, and stranded in a country that notoriously despises the poor." David stared at the envelope. It was a boarding pass. He looked back up at the VIP tier. Beatrice was laughing softly at something the French minister said. She didn't look down. She didn't scan the crowd. She was completely, entirely oblivious to his existence in the room. He was a ghost haunting a world that had successfully exorcised him. "You got your severance, Mr. Miller," Henrik said, turning to walk away. "Ghosts do not haunt the living. Go home." David stood alone by the marble pillar. The smell of expensive perfume and roasting meat made his stomach turn. He lowered his eyes, slid the envelope into his pocket, and walked out into the cold Swiss night. JFK Airport smelled of burnt jet fuel, stale pretzels, and damp winter coats. David dragged his bespoke leather weekender bag through the terminal, ignoring the sleek black town cars idling by the curb with chauffeurs holding white placards. He hailed a battered yellow taxi instead. He needed the jarring, uncomfortable friction of the cracked vinyl seat and the aggressive honking of the morning traffic to ground him. When the elevator doors parted, depositing him directly into the foyer of his Central Park West penthouse, the silence hit him like a physical blow. The apartment was pristine. The cleaning service he paid an exorbitant weekly fee had been there. The Brazilian walnut floors gleamed with a sterile chemical lemon scent. The air was perfectly temperature-controlled, flawlessly filtered, and completely dead. David dropped his bag on the floor. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that was instantly swallowed by the vastness of the room. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Down below Central Park was a sprawling rectangle of barren, graying trees and slushy asphalt. The people on the sidewalks looked like tiny, insignificant insects rushing to their insignificant jobs. He used to be one of them. He used to be the most ambitious insect in the hive, frantic to climb to the top of the glass. Now he was at the very top, and he realized there was absolutely no oxygen here. He shrugged off his cashmere coat, letting it fall carelessly onto an $80,000 imported Italian leather sofa. He walked into the kitchen. The matty black appliances stared back at him like the polished monoliths of a graveyard. He opened the highest cupboard. Hidden behind a row of unused crystal highball glasses was a single crinkled bag of discount coffee grounds. He had bought it 3 weeks ago at a bodega in Queens, a pathetic, desperate attempt to recapture the ghost of his former life. David pulled the bag down. His hands were shaking slightly. He didn't use the $3,000 espresso machine. He grabbed a cheap plastic drip filter he had ordered online and set it over a plain white mug. He boiled water in a heavy copper pot on the induction stove. He scooped the coarse, dark grounds into the paper filter, breathing in the bitter, almost burnt aroma. It smelled like Tuesday mornings in their cramped 2-bedroom apartment. It smelled like the annoyance he used to feel when she hummed under her breath. He poured the boiling water over the grounds, watching the dark liquid seep into the ceramic mug. He leaned against the cold granite counter, waiting, his reflection caught in the dark tinted glass of the oven door. He looked noticeably older. The sharp, arrogant angles of his face had softened into something haggard and hollow. The bespoke Savile Row suit he wore over his wrinkled dress shirt felt ridiculous, like a child playing dress-up in his father's closet. Henrik von Kassel's words echoed in the quiet kitchen. You were a remarkably ordinary, predictably selfish man who provided the perfect camouflage. He took a sip of the coffee. It burned the roof of his mouth, harsh and deeply acidic. He swallowed it down, waiting for the familiar wave of nostalgia, waiting to feel somehow connected to the woman he had slept next to for 6 years. But it was just bad coffee. There was no magic in the bitter taste. There was no secret warmth without the context of their struggle, without Beatrice standing at the sink in her faded cardigan. The cheap coffee was just a dark, muddy reminder of his own profound stupidity. He poured the rest of the mug down the stainless steel drain. He watched the dark liquid swirl and vanish, leaving nothing behind but a faint brown stain on the metal grate. He walked into the master bathroom. The marble floor was freezing against his bare feet. He opened the medicine cabinet. Sitting on the bottom shelf, right next to his expensive cedarwood cologne, was a single, plain gold band. He had taken it off the night he signed the NDA and the settlement papers. He picked it up. It felt impossibly light. It was a standard 14-carat ring they had bought at a strip mall jeweler because he was still paying off his student loans, and she had insisted she didn't want a diamond. I wanted a life where the biggest crisis was a burnt rose or a late mortgage payment. David squeezed the ring in his fist until the metal bit painfully into his palm. He finally understood the exact geometry of his ruin. He hadn't lost a billionaire duchess. He had never had her. What he had lost was the opportunity to be loved by a god who had willingly stepped off her pedestal just to share his meager, pathetic existence. She had offered him the world by pretending it didn't exist, and he had spent 6 years punishing her for it. He walked out of the bathroom and into the living room, standing in the center of the vast, empty space. He looked at the white walls. He could buy anything. He could travel anywhere. He had 15 million euros sitting in a secure offshore account, silently generating compound interest. He was completely, entirely free, and he had never been more trapped. He realized that the punishment Henrik and Beatrice had devised wasn't the exile from his firm. It wasn't the NDA or the threat of a financial clawback. The true punishment was the money itself, The 15 million euros stripped him of any excuse. If he had been left destitute, he could have blamed her. He could have rallied, built himself back up from the gutters, fueled by spite and the desperate, burning need to survive. The struggle would have given him a purpose. But she had insulated him from struggle forever. She had wrapped him in velvet and locked him in a vault. He couldn't even play the victim because society looked at his bank account and told him he had won. David walked over to the windows and pressed his forehead against the cold, reinforced glass. The sky over Manhattan was turning a bruised, heavy purple, threatening snow. Down below, the city lights flickered on millions of tiny glowing windows, hiding millions of ordinary, messy, beautiful lives. He slid the cheap gold ring onto his pinky finger. It didn't fit right, pinching the skin, creating a constant, dull ache. He left it there. It was the only real thing he had left. He closed his eyes, listening to the low, mechanical hum of the air conditioner. It was the only sound in the penthouse. It was the sound of his future, a long, uninterrupted, comfortable silence purchased at the exact cost of his soul. David finally got the wealth he always craved, but it ultimately cost him his soul and his marriage. He realized too late that true value isn't found in sterile luxury penthouses, but in the genuine connections we share with others. The 15 million euro settlement became his ultimate curse, leaving him completely trapped in a hollow, isolated existence. If you enjoyed this gripping story of hidden royalty, shattered egos, and instant karma, please hit that like button. Share this video with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories.